On December 30th, 1820, in a small ironworking village called Gysinge in central Sweden, a child walked through the snow toward home. He did not arrive. When the search party found him the next morning, what remained of his body lay in a clearing less than a quarter mile from the village edge. The tracks around him were unmistakable. A wolf, but not the kind of wolf anyone in Gysinge had ever seen before, because this wolf had no reason to fear them. He was the first. Over the next 87 days, 30 more people would be attacked in the same stretch of forest. 12 of them would die. Almost every single one was a child, and the thing hunting them had been raised by humans. Gysinge in 1820 was an ironworking community, a company town, built around a forge that had been producing iron since the 1600s. The village sat on the banks of the Dalälven River, surrounded by dense boreal forest. Winters were brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing for months. Snow covered the ground from November through April. The children of Gysinge walked everywhere. To school, to the forge to deliver meals to their fathers, to neighboring farms to help with chores. The paths between buildings were narrow corridors cut through deep snow, with forest pressing in on both sides. At this time of year in this part of Sweden, the sun rose around 9 in the morning and set before 3 in the afternoon. For 18 hours a day the world was dark. No one in Gysinge was afraid of wolves. Wolves in Sweden feared people. They stayed deep in the forest, hunted in packs and avoided human settlements at all costs. A wolf that approached a village was either rabid or starving, and neither had been seen in the region for years. What they did not know and could not have known was that the wolf stalking Gysinge was neither rabid nor starving. It was something far more dangerous. It was comfortable. A wild wolf is born with an inherent fear of people. Generations of persecution, hunting, trapping, poisoning, have written avoidance into its DNA at a level deeper than instinct. A healthy wild wolf will abandon a fresh kill rather than risk proximity to a human being. This fear is not learned, it is inherited. But inheritance requires a line. A wolf pup taken from its mother before it learns what to fear never develops that aversion. It grows up seeing humans as providers, sources of food, not threats. It learns that human settlements contain easy prey, chickens, goats, sheep, and eventually when hunger or opportunity aligns, it learns something else. Humans themselves are not particularly difficult to kill. They are slow, they are weak. They do not fight back the way a moose or a bear does. Here is what they do not usually put in the nature documentaries. A wolf does not need a pack to hunt. A pack is a social structure, not a biological requirement. A solitary wolf is perfectly capable of killing prey several times its own weight. The pack exists for territory defense and rearing its pups, not because individual wolves cannot hunt alone. The Wolf of Gysinge had no pack. It had been raised alone in a cage, behind the very ironworks whose children it now hunted. When it escaped, and no one recorded exactly when, it did not retreat into the deep forest. It stayed close to the village, because the village was where the food was. After the first child was killed on December 30th, the village held its breath. A single wolf attack was rare but not unprecedented. Perhaps the animal was desperate. Perhaps it would move on. It did not move on. On January 7th, an 8-year-old girl was attacked on her way to a neighbor's farm. She barely survived, but her face and neck were torn so severely that she was disfigured for life. The wolf had gone for her throat. That is not defensive behavior. That is predation. 3 days later, a 10-year-old boy was pulled into the trees behind the schoolhouse. He was found partially eaten. The attacks accelerated. By the end of January, 15 people had been attacked. 9 of them had been dead. The wolf was hunting every 2 to 3 days now, and it had developed a pattern. It struck during daylight hours, during the brief window when children walked between buildings. It always took its victims from the same stretch of road that ran between the village and the forge. Parents stopped sending their children to school. Farmers refused to let their sons and daughters deliver meals to the forge. The village went quiet, but the wolf did not stop. It simply moved closer. On February 4th, it attacked a child in the village itself just yards from a house with a fire burning inside. The parents heard the scream. By the time they reached the door, the wolf had already begun to drag the body toward the tree line. The youngest victim was 3.5 years old. If you want more terrifying real monster stories like this one, then subscribe now. We post stories like this every 5 to 8 days. And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest news, images, and updates. By early February, the situation in Gysinge had become a crisis. Word reached Stockholm. The crown dispatched soldiers, hunters, and trackers, men who had hunted wolves across the Swedish wilderness for decades. They brought dogs, they brought traps, they organized drives through the forest with hundreds of men beating the underbrush, trying to flush the animal into an open field where marksmen could bring it down. Nothing worked. The wolf evaded every hunt. It slipped through every cordon. The dogs lost the scent repeatedly, as if the animal knew exactly where to walk to confuse them. The hunters reported something deeply unsettling. This wolf did not behave like a wild wolf. It did not flee in a straight line when pursued. It circled back. It doubled around. It hid in places no wild wolf would choose. It hid behind the forge, in drainage ditches near the village, and under structures that still carried the scent of humans. The trackers began to suspect what the villagers had already begun to whisper. This was not a wild animal that had wandered into town by accident. This was an animal that knew Gysinge and that had been raised there. It had learned from years of proximity that there was nothing in this village to fear. They were right. The wolf had been captured as a pup in 1817, somewhere in the forest of Dalarna, and brought to the Gysinge ironworks. It was kept in a cage. The workers fed it. The children probably stared at it through the bars. For 3 years it watched the rhythms of the village. It learned the paths. It learned the timing. It learned the people. And then, sometime in the autumn of 1820, it either escaped or was released. No one recorded which. The hunters had been tracking a wild predator through the Swedish winter when in reality they were hunting an animal that had never been wild at all. The theory that the Wolf of Gysinge was simply a rabid or injured outlier was almost certainly wrong. Modern wildlife biologists who have studied captive raised predators describe a consistent pattern. An animal that grows up without fear of humans does not see them as threats. It sees them as part of the landscape. The wolf's behavior was not random violence, it was systematic predation. The pattern of attacks tells the story. The wolf struck almost exclusively during daylight hours in a specific location along the path between the village and the forge. It targeted children almost exclusively. Of the 31 victims, only one was an adult. A 19-year-old woman attacked on March 23rd, 4 days before the wolf was finally killed. The victims ranged in age from 3.5 to 15. The wolf was selecting for size. This is consistent with what modern biologists now understand about captive raised predators. An animal that grows up without fear of humans does not see them as threats. It sees them as part of the landscape. And if that animal becomes hungry enough, or if the opportunity presents itself, it will eventually test whether the humans around it are prey. The Wolf of Gysinge tested that hypothesis 31 times. 12 of those tests were fatal. The success rate was nearly 40% higher than the success rate of wolves hunting their natural prey in the wild. The killing of the wolf, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. On March 27, 1821, 87 days after the first attack, a group of hunters cornered the animal in a wooded area near the village. It did not run. It did not attempt to evade them the way it had evaded every other hunting party for 3 months. According to contemporary accounts, it turned and faced them. A single shot brought it down. The body was examined. The wolf was a male, approximately 5 years old, and in good physical condition. It wasn't sick or starving. It wasn't rabid. It showed none of the markers that typically explain why a predator turns to hunting human beings. The only abnormality was the one the villagers had already guessed. It had been raised in captivity. The scars on its body, the wear on its teeth, and the condition of its coat all matched the profile of an animal that had spent years in confinement. The aftermath was devastating, not for Gysinge but for every wolf in Sweden. The attacks triggered a nationwide extermination campaign. Bounties were raised, hunting intensified. Within decades, wolves had been driven to functional extinction in the country. By the late 1800s, there were no breeding wolf populations left in Sweden. A species that had inhabited the Scandinavian peninsula since the last ice age was gone, erased not because of what wolves normally do, but because of what one wolf, raised by humans, had done. The Wolf of Gysinge killed 12 people in 3 months. The human response killed every wolf in Sweden for the next 150 years. The monsters were never imaginary. We just got comfortable.